Good evening, everyone. My name is Chloe Howenstein, and I am the coordinator for this year's Development Roundtable series. The Development Roundtable series is an event, a high-profile speaker series where leaders and practitioners within the international development sphere address our students, faculty, and the broader community on trends and challenges that are shaping the field. On behalf of the International Development Program here at SAIS, I would like to welcome you to all of you to today's event with Dr. Daniel Honig. Here to introduce Dr. Honig is Dr. Deborah Brodegum, the Bernard L. Schwartz Professor in International Political Economy and the Director of the China-Africa Research Initiative. Dr. Brodegum has been a visiting scholar at the World Bank, a Senior Research Fellow at the International Food Policy Research Institute, and has advised more than a dozen governments on China-Africa relations. I would now like to introduce Dr. Brodegum to introduce Dr. Honig.
Thank you. It gives me huge pleasure, but not as much pleasure as it gives Dan Honig, I'm sure, to be here with his book being launched. But to introduce Dan Honig, who is a treasured colleague of ours in the International Development Program. When Dan applied for his job with us in the International Development Program, we were blown away by his resume. He put together in one person exactly what we were looking for. I don't know how much you know about this guy here. He's not only a fantastic academic, obviously, he's a professor at Johns Hopkins SAIS, and this book is testimony to his academic prowess, but he's also a practitioner. He's worked in amazing places around the world. In Liberia, where he worked with the Ministry of Finance. In East Timor, where he set up his own NGO. In Thailand, where he was with the Ashoka Foundation. Maipen Kontai. But in all of these places, what Dan did was situational participant observation. And he took that back to the university and used that to write this amazing book. So Dan, to give you more of his traditional curriculum vitae, he holds a BA from the University of Michigan. And anyone that knows Dan knows that this is not just, some random fact about him. Yes. He has a PhD from Harvard University, from the Kennedy School of Government. And he is a neighbor of ours, of SAIS. He lives around the corner. So all of this means that he's also available as an amazing teacher. So he's a wonderful teacher, a fantastic researcher, and a super colleague. And I won't tell you about the times that I've heard the Michigan National Anthem coming from his, it's state anthem, excuse me, from his office, but it's been more than once. So Dan, we are so thrilled that you're launching your book today here at SAIS. Come on up and tell us about it.
So much. And Pedro, if you can, perfect, turn me on back there. So first, thank you, Deborah, for what I take to be, thank you for the very warm introduction and for your support for nationhood for America's greatest state of Michigan. I appreciate the commitment you've made here today to support one of the great enterprises of our time. And so, and thank you also for referencing that, I've spent some time wandering around and thinking in the field about the things I write about in this book. So maybe that's the right place to start, here in Liberia. So this is the view out my office window about a decade ago when I was the special advisor to the aid management advisor to the Minister of Finance in Liberia. And I took this picture for no future use reason, frankly. I took it because the windows were clean, right? And that was not a common thing. The windows had just been replaced, and I thought on this day, possibly the only day that I would be able to take a picture of exactly what it looked like out my office window, I should do so. But as I think about this picture now, it occurs to me that there are a bunch of things we can see in this picture that can help us understand, that can help us think about the development challenges that Liberia 10 years ago, coming out of civil war, faced, right? So here in the top right of the photo is a building, a government building that had been partially destroyed in the war. We could imagine an aid project that would work to rehabilitate that building, that would go floor by floor, that would work on the sort of maybe the foundation of the building and then the structural supports that could use a blueprint to get us to a rehabilitated structure. We can imagine a similar kind of project design to rebuild the bridge here at the top of the picture, a bridge that had fallen down, that had been blown up actually during the war. We could imagine that kind of project working to turn on the traffic lights. Here in the foreground is a traffic light that's not working. There are no working traffic lights in Liberia at this time. And we could imagine getting the lights turned on with a clear development project that worked on clearly observable measures of success. And we can imagine the same for turning the lights on in this building just behind. This building, incidentally, is the Ministry of Transportation that is responsible for the traffic light just in front of the door. And the lights are ministry, even though it's midday on a cloudy day, because there is no electricity grid. All power is being generated from generators, and that makes it expensive. And so people leave their lights off. So we can imagine turning on the lights that way, but it's a lot harder to imagine the kind of observable, verifiable indicators that would get us to success if instead what we thought about was turning on the energies and capacity of the people inside that ministry, the people responsible for supervising the transportation system, the systems for monitoring health, for improving healthcare, for improving education, et cetera. While there are many things we can circle on a picture like this that we might want to improve, that we can imagine aid projects working towards, there are also plenty of things we can't. And how does that affect how we should manage staff, how we should drive our organization towards results? So in thinking about how to manage aid organizations, managers face, I would say, two flawed choices. So here on the right is a Turkish expression which translates roughly to spit up, you hit the mustache, spit down, you hit the beard, right? There's no perfect choice here. It's not like there's like some right answer somewhere that everyone should just go for. There are downsides to anything an aid organization could decide to do. So on the one hand, if an aid organization decides to control things from above, to navigate from the top, as I put it, they're going to get clear management control, they're going to get oversight, they're going to be able to standardize the behavior of their agents. People in different places are going to do similar things because we're going to have controls that push them in that direction. We might be able to use targets and measurement to drive people towards performance, to pay for performance, to get extrinsic motivation. But on the other hand, we're going to get distortions born of those measurement and controls. We're going to get less flexibility and adaptability. If a job involves multiple things, some of which are observable and some of which are unobservable, and we reward people based on the observable part, they're going to overinvest in that observable part and thus underinvest in the part that can't be seen. If we don't give people control on the ground, they may not gather the local information that might be critical to success. So, this follows from Philippe Aghion and Nobel laureate John Tirol's contract theory work. If we don't give people autonomy, if we don't give people on the ground control, why will they bother engaging in costly action to figure out what's going on? Why not play racquetball or watch Netflix or do any of the other things they could do with their time? On the other hand, if an agency decides to empower the people on the ground to lead what that agency does, to navigate by judgment, by the judgment of those agents, as I put it, they're going to get agent initiative. They're going to get soft information, so that is things that can be seen but can't be codified up a hierarchy. They might get more intrinsic motivation. There's some work that shows more autonomy to people leads to more sort of internal motivation by those folks for the job. But they're going to have to rely on fallible agent judgment. This means not just the greater potential for waste, fraud, and abuse for agents who are pointed in the right direction, who are pointed in the wrong direction, who don't want good things for the organization. It also simply means relying on fallible agent judgment. I suspect if we look inside ourselves, we can all think of something we've done in the last week where we made a judgment call, and that judgment call in a small or a not so small way was not the right call, it turned out, right? We learned from that, but we also make mistakes. And if we rely on the judgment of agents, then we're going to have to live with those mistakes, which sometimes may well point things in the wrong direction. So why I argue that agencies get the balance wrong for two big reasons. So the first big reason is broadly documents like this. That is to say, reports to Congress and political authorizers. If I need to report up on what I'm doing as a public agency, that requires me gathering information about what I'm doing in a way that then controls my agents. Put another way, if I'm going to report on how many people I've trained in the world using USAID funds, I need to ask my agents to gather information about how many people I've trained. I need to tell them in each project to meet metrics regarding how much training is occurring, right? And while everyone has to report up on performance, some agencies are more worried about this reporting than others. Some agencies are more insecure than others. And this leads, I argue, to differences in how likely agencies are to navigate by judgment. The second reason that I think systematically agencies and organizations get this wrong has less to do with politics and more to do with human nature. So that is to say, the error of too little control is obvious. We're going to have agents who steal things. We're going to have projects that go awry. We're going to have judgments that were proved wrong. But the error of too much control is a lot harder to observe. The error of too much control, I'm arguing, is foregone agent behavior that we're never going to see. It's the thing that your person on the ground would have done if they had more autonomy, but chose not to do. And so we have two kinds of error here. One of which is perfectly observable, right, and often generates headlines and attention when it happens, and one of which can't be observed. And any organization, any person faced with a problem they can see and a problem they can't see is likely to overreact to the problem they can see relative to the one they can't. And that leads me to hypothesize and to argue that organizations are likely to get the balance wrong because of politics, but not just because of politics. I think even the least politically insecure, the least managing up organizations may also get this a little bit wrong. So this leads broadly to four predictions about what agencies are going to do and when this is going to hurt their performance. So first, I'm arguing that on that kind of too much versus too little control sort of scale I suggested moments ago, agencies are going to err much more on the side of too much control than they are going to err on the side of too little, and that more insecure agencies are more likely to make this error, or are likely to make it in a broader variety of places. And what about the kind of effects of control? Well, I argue that navigation by judgment is likely to help us more when environments are more unpredictable. So another way of putting that is the greater the scope of the unknown unknowns, the more we need somebody on the ground who's going to be able to perceive those things and react to them to guide what happens in the organization. In addition, as I mentioned, as I sort of tried to intro with the Liberia picture at the beginning, not all tasks are created equal, right? So for some tasks, constructing that bridge, for example, we can imagine the kind of pre-planned blueprint, and we can imagine the output numbers that would help us manage what happens as the project is going on, help us understand what's happening. For other tasks, like those kind of capacity building and systemic projects I was talking about, that's going to be a lot harder. And so the more we can manage by those numbers, the more verifiable, in my language, the task, the lesser the returns to navigation by judgment. So the less we can manage that way, the greater the returns, right? So depicted graphically, it looks a little bit like this, right? So a couple things I want to say about this graph. So a high navigation by judgment organization, I'm arguing, is going to do better as environmental predictability and task verifiability fall, right? But a couple things about this claim. One, I'm not arguing that the optimal level of navigation by judgment is ever 100% in some way, right? The claim here isn't we should ever just let people go without any controls whatsoever, right? Nor is the claim that somehow an organization that trusts its field staff is going to do better as countries are harder to navigate, are harder to work in. It's that they're going to do relatively better, right? So it is easier to implement a roads project in South Africa than to implement a roads project in Papua New Guinea, right? That is going to be true for any kind of management style, but it's going to be differentially true for different kinds of management styles as you move from one to the other kind of context. So to test this hypothesis, to test this theory, first, I put a lot of data together. So I assembled a database of 14,000 projects across 9 aid agencies, across 50 years, across 180 recipients, across a couple hundred kinds of sectors, right? And I'm happy to talk more about how I got these data. To those of you who are familiar with the World Bank's PPAR, with the World Bank's public data, think about something like that, but with 8 other agencies added to that, right? That looks at kind of the holistic performance of various projects. And I should say 8 of these 9 donors' information is cleaned and available on a public website that especially the students in the room should feel very welcome to make use of in your senior theses and projects and various other things. I think we need to think more about organizational performance and in systematic ways, and putting this data out there is hopefully a helpful way of pushing that forward a little bit. So those projects span the globe, right? So one thing about development aid is if we think about it on a 50-year time horizon, it incorporates lots more countries than I bet you think of, than I thought of when I hear the term developing countries, right? So there are plenty of countries where aid doesn't happen. At least there are a few countries where aid doesn't happen. There are no projects in Canada, none in the US, none in Australia. I should say there was one project, there was an EU election observation mission in the US, so I almost had an American project, but it didn't have a result score. They had no idea how they did at the end, so I couldn't use it. But most of the rest of the world sees development projects, at least over this kind of time scale. And today I'll talk mostly about the projects that have happened since 1994, which is about 10,000 projects. And here's what I find. So broadly, I find, and I'm happy to talk about the econometrics and the models and all that if people want in Q&A, I find that organizations that give their agents more control, that have higher navigation by judgment scores, see much less of a decline in project performance as environmental unpredictability rises. So as the going gets tough, those that engage in navigation by judgment are more capable of dealing with the rockier terrain. But that's not true of less navigation by judgment prone organizations. When we're trying to control things from the top, when we're trying to guide our, autonomous driving vehicle from some central headquarters, right? It works less well when we hit rocky roads. The system is less able to cope with that kind of uncertainty and unpredictability. And this effect is driven by less verifiable sectors. So that is by things like the management of agriculture projects rather than the delivery of drip irrigation to farmers, right? The management of transportation projects rather than the construction of roads and bridges. We see no sort of statistically significant difference when we think about those easy to measure, easy to verify tasks. The effect is driven by the others. So let me add some color to this for those of you who don't look at that regression analysis and think, wow, that really jumps off the page, right? So, which is all but the 15 economists in the room or something like that. So, so let's talk a little bit about a few of these case studies. So I do 8 case studies in the book, and I'm going to talk about just 2 of them. So I vary these case studies by the propensity of aid organizations to navigate by judgment, by the predictability of the environment, and by whether the task is verifiable or not. And I'm going to talk right now about the pair that compares municipal government capacity building in South Africa. So South Africa is my more predictable case pair as compared to Liberia, right? And municipal government capacity building is my less verifiable task it's a task where it's harder to come up with kind of top-down measures that might work to get something done. And I should say USAID, the US government aid agency, is my low propensity to navigate by judgment agency, and DFID. For those of you who are laughing, I take that as assent and in broad strokes, thank you. And the UK's Department for International Development, or DFID, is my high propensity to navigate by judgment agency. So first, one thing that's really striking in these data is that it really does seem like control is rolling downhill, like control is coming from the top and affecting people at lower levels of the delegation chain. And that this links to reporting and to what agents actually do. So in South Africa, in the transcripts, there were 13 mentions of Congress and only 1 of Parliament. And when I saw this, I found myself thinking, my first thought was, oh, when did Parliament come up? I actually don't remember that from any of the interviews. And the answer is, I said it. Right? So I asked somebody who kept talking about Congress. I said, look, you keep talking about Congress. What about Parliament? Are they coming up? Are people talking about Parliament here? This is somebody, I should say, who worked for both of the projects I'm about to tell you about at different points in time, and thus was able to compare across the two. And he said, no, not really, man. You know, like, people would occasionally talk about London, maybe, or something like that in the UK Parliament. But it's not like in the US. You know, for the US, it was always the Congress wants these numbers because they are providing so much for South Africa, and they want to know what it is that we have done with their money. And what I love about this quote, the part of the quote I've put in bold here, is it makes perfect sense. You know, if I gave somebody far away a lot of money, I would also want to know what they had done with their money, right? What happened to my money? I don't think we need to imply it, while there surely might be ill will, I don't think we need ill will to drive this result. We just need earnest concern about the results of things put through systems that end up undermining the very performance they seek to maximize. So as to kind of authorizing insecurity inside the US government, Andrew Natsios, a former administrator that is the head of USAID, once wrote a paper describing what he called USAID's obsessive measurement disorder, which he defined as the condition that made you think that counting things was likely to drive better performance just by virtue of counting them. There are interviews with folks at PEPFAR, including this one, which suggests that when targets are set from above, everything flows down. Numbers add up to meet an arbitrary goal. Another US government long-serving USAID person describes the agency as under siege for, I guess, going on 30 years now. And what happens when you're an aid agency under siege? Well, it makes you cautious, right? When you think you're under siege, when you need to be able to justify and defend everything you do, you don't take smart risks in addition to maybe. So even before we get to, is there too much risk being taken? There's not enough risk being taken, right, is the argument here. So let's talk about these projects specifically. So USAID and DFID in the mid-2000s set out to do basically comparable things. So they set out to improve, as USAID puts it, the municipal planning skills and operating systems of South African municipal governments. So you should have in mind things like expenditure management, debt management, procurement, the kind of basic IT and finance systems that we could imagine driving performance, driving good government, driving the sort of conduct of government's business. And they do this in very different ways. So, and I should say these projects are in about the same number of communities. So one is in 18, the other is in 16 communities. And they cost almost exactly the same amount of money. So the differences here are not scope, they're not scale, they're not the amount of money available for the project. There's something other than those kind of obvious determinants of difference between development projects. So USAID is going to drive this project using training visits. People need skills. We are going to train them in those skills. DFID drives its project by putting advisors into communities, by actually hiring consultants, hiring contractors, and putting them in the communities that they wish to serve, that they wish to improve. And what does this mean in practice? Well, it means that what it means to sort of deliver the job for USAID is to train staff on implementation, to conduct the training. And for DFID, it means something a lot squishier, a lot less there's a lot less attempt to verify in this kind of verifiability sense I was talking about before, right? Advisors are going to advise and mentor managers on achieving targets, on planning and budgeting, on delivery obstacles. And so how should we get started? How should we actually start driving this project? Well, USAID is going to have hands-on mentoring dates for training on specific things, right? I should say the rota of this is incredible. It's like, I can tell you that on February 8th, 2007, two people drove 325 mileage reimbursed miles, drove 325 miles to go to this community where they delivered a training between 10:15 and 11:32, right? At which time they then went and drove to this community, this other community. For DFID, advisors are going to figure out what's going on. They're going to conduct an assessment of the status quo and prepare a report. They're going to diagnose the problem before they start prescribing solutions. And what does that mean in terms of what these agents are being driven to? In terms of the control of reporting, the control of what we're telling agents they need to do? Well, on the USAID side, we are going to declare success if we've trained the staff. So in practice, that means we're going to count people at the training in just the kind of way I kind of alluded to as a macro indicator at the beginning of the talk. On the other hand, for the DFID project, advisors are going to implement their work plans and report on that progress, largely qualitatively, largely in a narrative sense. So you might remember the advisors on the DFID side just came up with their own work plans, right? So basically you're saying to the DFID advisors, how about you go out there, figure out what you need to do, then tell me how you're doing on the thing you told me you needed to do, right? So this is not a terribly tight control. I'm letting you write the test, take the test, and assess your performance on the test, right? Which is probably not a good way to run a standardized test. And this isn't a standardized sort of treatment. And we could imagine flaws of too much control on one side and too little control on the other. So what happens at the end? Well, what happens is that the USAID deputy chief of party, that is kind of the deputy in charge of the project, says the USAID project might not have had that much impact. A trainer involved in the training says, I don't think the training's contributed much because you show up, you've got no authority. You basically just need people to come in and tell you that, that this is happening, right? That they've shown up for the training. That's basically what I'm reporting on. And I should say, I've spent a fair bit of my life either involved in or talking to people about development projects. And it is really unusual to have people tell you, I spent 3 years doing something, and I don't think it really did that much. And that doesn't need to be like an intent to deceive. It's also just kind of like, you know, if you've spent years of your life doing something, you want to believe it's had a difference. And this is really a kind of, in my opinion, these are not the only two such quotes, a kind of remarkable suggestion of the kind of non-performance of the USAID project. On the other hand, what happens to the DFID project? Well, the DFID project doesn't always work either. So some of those advisors I was talking about make the wrong judgments, right? Some of them drive their projects in the wrong direction. But some of them are remarkably effective. And in interviews with the municipal managers they served, with those communities, in looking at kind of the audit performance of the communities in which they served as well, we see some remarkable examples of success, which is exactly actually what DFID says about its own project. It says, in my opinion, quite honestly, that although uneven in parts, there are some highly positive examples in selected municipalities. So it's not the case here. I'm not telling you a story where judgment, you know, leads to some perfect world of 100% success and fully transformed communities, right? It's that we have a horse that goes nowhere on one side and a horse that makes some distance down the track in some places on the other. And what's the comparison between those two horses? So what leads to that failure? What leads to that USAID horse, now that I've wandered into this analogy? What leads to that USAID horse not getting out of the gate, right? You know, it might have something to do with the fact that the numbers are chosen because they're easier to count, but those numbers, by the admission of the people involved in the project, don't really tell about the impact of the project. It might be because the USAID project becomes a numbers game, a reporting game about numbers and information to generate those numbers to report back to political authorizers on the back end. And there is numbers chasing towards the end of the project. You know, particularly remarkable is there are all of these quotes suggesting that the reason the DFID project did better is in part a closer working relationship with the government of South Africa, right? And it's tempting to think of that as kind of a strategic choice by those who operated the project on the ground. But what's particularly interesting in this case, in my view, is that that's a choice that USAID project staff wanted to make but were precluded from making. Right? So the people who ran this USAID project, the chief of party, the head implementer of the project, the week before he took that title, closed up his office inside the South African federal ministry that thought about local development. His immediate prior job was being an advisor to the relevant minister, right? So the question here isn't, does he have the local knowledge? He does. He's been advisor for a couple of years to this ministry. But USAID pulls him out of that kind of interface. Why? Well, because USAID is worried about, I think the quote here is, USAID had an understandable concern that if he remained in the government ministry, he might end up focusing on things other than the project. Right? So in an attempt to control the project, in an attempt to make sure the project got results for the project, for the American taxpayer, they move this person out of the very kind of information environment where they already have deep and extensive links. So just to move to kind of the qualitative results as a whole, we see clear constraints here stemming from political authorizing environments to agents. We see, I would argue, an ability to navigate by judgment linked to success, particularly in less legible environments, in more unpredictable environments, and with less verifiable tasks. And we see evidence both of kind of this soft information channel, this ability to judge things on the ground and incorporate it into what the organization does, and what I'll call the organizational learning channel, right? So when you made that judgment that went wrong in the last week, you learned something about your own capacity to judge. But you can't learn those things if you don't engage in judgment. Organizations that trust their people to make those kinds of judgments also gain the ability to learn from what they learn as a result of those judgments in a way that those that never attempt can never learn from them. That's not to say navigation by judgment is perfect. So there's a case pair in South African health where I end up arguing in the delivery of antiretroviral drugs, where I end up arguing that USAID's top-down measurement-driven approach gets more drugs in more people's mouths more efficiently than an attempt by DFID to do similar things, particularly in the period of aid denialism that was occurring at the time. So the measurement regime keeps USAID focused on delivering the numbers, both when that's a good thing to do and when that's a bad thing to do. So here are the kind of qualitative results in sum. DFID is the red, USAID's the blue, and so I find that DFID is more successful with its greater navigation by judgment in 3 of the 4 case pairs. Here's that hypothesis graph I showed you based on no data whatsoever a little bit earlier. And here are those quantitative results, right? And what I want to argue is that what these add up to is a kind of contingent role, a contingent place for more judgment, for the error of too much control driving things in the wrong direction. So in sum, I'm arguing that political authorizing environments can induce suboptimally conservative behavior, right? So that is to say, constraints, much like poo, rolls downhill in the American expression, right? So that output measurement is a key tool constraining field staff, right? That measurement isn't neutral. Asking people to drive towards targets is a powerful tool for good or for ill. And we need to think about when we deploy that tool, that this navigation by judgment is contingently beneficial, and more broadly, that organizational structure and bureaucratic incentives matter in aid delivery, right? So we've started to unpack this kind of implementation box in development economics and the study of the developing world more broadly. And to me, part of that implementation box is the internal functioning of aid agencies as they interface with the developing world vis-a-vis the projects we're talking about. So what should aid agencies do? Well, one thing they might do is measure smarter, not harder, right? So that is to say, more numbers doesn't always equal more information. Part of the argument here is that sometimes data is actually not telling you about the performance of what you're trying to measure. They should, I argue, pilot new navigation strategies where we relax constraints and evaluate success. So if you take these messages on board, let's actually try new things, at least maybe starting in places where we already don't think we're succeeding, right? There are plenty of things that aid agencies off the record would agree they don't think they're getting transformational change. They don't think they're getting the change they're looking for. So particularly where the baseline is not success, why not try something new? Aid agencies could also leverage comparative advantage. There's been this talk in the aid community over the past, let's say 25 years in particular, that agencies need to sort of coordinate. Maybe one of those margins of coordination is what kinds of agencies are going to be more successful at what kind of projects, at what kind of tasks, and distributing projects along those margins. And for all of us, for those of us who are inside organizations now, for those of us who imagine those jobs in the future, for those of us on the outside, we can point out when reporting is most likely to undermine performance, when decisions are being made. How many rooms, I imagine there are a number of you who have been in rooms where someone said, yeah, we know that measure is flawed, but it's the best measure, so let's go with it, right? So let's question that. Let's say, well, sometimes maybe an imperfect measure is worse than no measure at all. And let's at least have that conversation with ourselves and our teams when and where we can. In terms of broader implications, look, aid agencies are public agencies. So if you squint, an aid agency is a remarkable public agency that works in lots of different countries and does kind of almost everything the public sector does and manages it in a standard way, right? What better data source for figuring out more generally about how public sectors can manage and how they can work? And in that frame, I think we need to think more about the reductive seduction and power of metrics, about where numbers, monitoring, and measurement are leading us. I imagine, like me, some of you listen to the NPR podcast Planet Money, right? And Planet Money, not so long ago, had an episode called "The Future of Work is Like a UPS Truck," right? And did anyone listen to this episode? Does it ring a bell for anyone? Excellent. One in the back. Thank you, Liz. So as Liz and I know, and I recommend listening to the episode, what it describes is this world in which everything is measured and everything is monitored. So UPS drivers are told what order to load their packages in. They're told where to park on the street to optimize delivery, right? They're told what pocket to put their pen in based on which hand they will be using more, based on where the doorknobs are of the houses that they will be delivering to, right? That is remarkable. And perhaps that improves performance when what we're doing is delivering packages, something perfectly verifiable in America with predictable roads and trucks and drivers that we can understand and track. But guess what? Most of the world, not just most of the developing world, most of the world does not look like a UPS truck. And if indeed, to the title of the Planet Money episode, the future of work does look like a UPS truck, we need to start thinking more about what we gain, not only what we gain, but also what we lose when we make work go that way. So James Q. Wilson, a scholar of American government, wrote a kind of foundational book to the study of bureaucracy about 30 years ago, in which he was deeply concerned and thought it really mattered what we could see in the public sector. And his example of tasks for which we couldn't really observe anything helpful were teachers and cops, right? Teachers now, I mean, teacher measurement, standardized testing, this is an incredibly active debate in our public discourse. And cops, you know, are a form of observation, a form of measurement, a form of verifiability that we are just now, in the last couple months, I think, wrestling with the effectiveness of in a variety of ways. So I'm not saying standardized testing is bad. I'm not saying body cameras are bad. What I'm saying is when we do these things, we don't just gain. We also lose. We lose scope for judgment. We lose scope for discretion. And we need to think about that trade-off as we think about where our world is going and where our jobs are going. and beyond politics, thinking beyond the political regime entirely, every organization worries about kind of managing up. And I think well beyond the public sector, there's this tension between reporting up and doing down that we need to think more critically about. Maybe sometimes we can get more juice, more performance juice with less squeezing. I need a better analogy for this, by the way. For a while I used sand, like, when you squeeze sand, you end up with less of it in your hand, Now I've gone to the juice. Suggestions very welcome. Suggestions very welcome. But the point is, maybe sometimes we can get more with less. And so, with that, I'd like to close, but after saying just one more thing about the book, which is available. I should say I drove to Baltimore today because there was a shipping issue to pick up the books that are available out back. So I navigated BWI. I used Google Maps, I'll confess. I used technology to get me there. So I want to say one more thing about this book, which is, in this case, I kind of do want you to judge the book by its cover. So does anyone recognize the photo on the cover? So, what's that? Guy who went off the coast of Boston. It is off the coast of Boston. Thank you. Yeah, exactly. So there's this town in Massachusetts, which can someone pronounce it right? Gloucester. So there's a statue in that town in Massachusetts that is to the fishing fleet of Massachusetts, right? This town is where The Perfect Storm, the book, and the movie are set, right? And this statue, called locally Man at the Wheel, this man at the wheel is a tribute to people who have died at sea, right? So let's think about those people who've died at sea in the context of this argument. So they have used their judgment and paid the ultimate price for the use of that judgment. And that's tragic. And we mourn them, and we build statues to them, and that is entirely appropriate. But what we don't do is say that because some people failed using judgment, what we need to do is remove judgment from the entire class of actors. So that is to say, no one thinks that the way to manage a fishing fleet is to do it by GPS from some central headquarters. We continue to trust captains to navigate those oceans. The question isn't, does judgment sometimes fail? Of course it does. Judgment sometimes fails. The question is, how does that level of failure compare to the next best alternative? And that's what I encourage all of us to think more about. Thank you. And I'm happy to do questions. Yeah, so yes. First question down here.
Professor Honig. I actually have two questions, if you don't mind. So the first one is on measurement. So how did you code the organizations that are high in navigation by judgment and low? And then also, how did you measure the risk of the predictability of the environment? And then the second question is on those organizations that have low navigation by judgment scores. So for those, how much of their poor performance do you think? So you were arguing that a lot of their poor performance is attributable to the fact that they don't give their field agents enough discretion. Besides that, how much of that do you think is driven by the fact that a lot of the times their measurements, their quantitative measurements are poorly designed, as in there seems to be two sets of indicators. So then on the one hand, there's inputs-driven indicators, and then on the other hand, outputs-driven. So as in the USAID case with the HIV, you were talking about how they measure in terms of how many people they distributed those antiretroviral to, and then on the other hand, there were which were the output ones, and then there were the input ones in which they measured how many people they trained. But in that case, if, for example, they instead measured the outcomes of the training in terms of, for example, if it's a training for vocational education, then if they measure it by the percentage of people that successfully got employment after that training, then how much do you think that would affect the outcomes? Thank
Thanks.
you.
Happy to take a couple more. Gentleman in the front.
Thanks, Professor Honig. That was really insightful. So I guess my question is, from your findings, we understand that in these sort of more uncertain environments, giving greater discretion to agents on the ground leads to better results. I'm wondering the extent to which that also depends on the sort of quality or the training of the agents themselves, and whether you can speak to how agencies that offer more discretion may differ also in the quality of people they recruit, the ways that they train them, and how that then factors into project performance.
Great. Maybe one more.
Hi, thank you so much for your talk. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about the different agencies that you review and how you evaluated them on the degree to which they choose navigation by judgment as a strategy, and how much that comes from. So how did these organizational cultures evolve? Like, why do we see a much more bureaucratic approach from USAID versus DFID?
So let me just take those three and then talk some more, and then here's some more questions. And great questions all. So to maybe start from the numbers and build out sort of in broad, kind of from my view, west to east across these questions, right? So I kind of at a meso level, let me talk about these measures, and I'm happy to sort of talk in more detail sort of offline, or of course it's in the book, were you to care to go there. So, so you're absolutely right. There's some real measurement challenges here. For environmental unpredictability, I'm using something called the State Fragility Index, which is the Polity 4 measure of how fragile a state is. The argument there being that more fragile states are more unpredictable. For how organizations navigate by judgment, I do something. It's very good that you asked that question, actually, because it allows me to respond in a way that incorporates someone in the room who I need to thank personally, actually. So the first part of the answer is I take from the Paris Declaration monitoring surveys, that is monitoring surveys that attempted to figure out the practices of both aid recipients and aid donors. I take some measures that look broadly at the extent to which agencies devolve control, to which they're control freaks about their work, and then about how politically secure they were, right? And those two subscales end up being quite well correlated. I then validate that measure I validate that measure through a field study of aid management sort of experts. And basically what you should have in mind is someone who works in a developing country who deals with many donors. And I ask that person, when you talk to the French relative to when you're talking to the British, to when you're talking to the bank, how much control do the people on the ground have to actually drive what happens? It turns out that a lot of aid bureaucrats talk about this, but very few aid bureaucrats can really substantively compare more than one or two or three agencies, right? But from the developing countryside, I think we can get an actual comparative standard of sort of what we're looking to measure here. So on project success, how we figure out how successful the project is, I'm using a measure from the agencies themselves. The agencies say how successful they think their project is. And there's lots of reason for thinking that we have noise in that measure. And I think about that, and I think about how much noise there is in two ways. So first, I can see who evaluates the project, and I can make sure that who's evaluating the project isn't driving the results, right? So sometimes we have project staff evaluating it, sometimes independent auditors, independent evaluation units, and we can see how much that matters to project success. The second thing I did is, I kind of wanted to get to as close to the meat of what happens in the projects as I could, in some kind of systematic way for projects that happened a long time ago, right? And so I turned to the World Bank archives. And Shireen Thompson, who very kindly facilitated my time in the archives, is here in the audience today. Thank you for joining us, Shireen. And what I did in the archives is I found examples of projects where one project's phase did pretty well and the other one did not so well, right? So phase 1 got a 5 on a 6-point scale and phase 2 got a 2 on a 6-point scale, or vice versa. So I found projects that had that feature where we might most expect to see errors, right? Maybe the 5 is a totally sort of inflated number that we should worry about. And I requested the archives to pull all documents related to the project. And then Shireen could verify this, but I want to say 3 months later, something like that. It takes some time to gather all the documents. About that. So about 3 months later, I showed up, and frankly, I'd forgotten which was the phase 1, which was the high, and which was the low, and that was by design, right? I sat down in the World Bank archives, and Shireen presented me with boxes upon boxes upon boxes upon boxes of documents. And I spent a few weeks reading through those documents and trying to figure out what score I would have given these projects, right? And so, of course, this score doesn't involve talking to people, right? I can't actually go back and re-interview people. I didn't try to. This is 40 years after the fact. And so we might imagine there's good reason for some variation between my measure and the World Bank's official measure. And I didn't always agree with the World Bank's score. But in every case, I agreed that the more successful project was the more successful project. And the less successful project was the less successful project. Me some confidence in these evaluations. So how did these agencies get here? These agencies that I'm evaluating differently, right? I think that's a really good question. So we have this equilibrium here. If what we're asking is how do we shift the equilibrium, well, the first question is, how did this get created? And I think that part of it is sort of different political cultures in general. Part of it are professional setups. So one thing that I think really helps in the UK is there are professional staff of an international development committee that can sort of intermediate what happens and can educate MPs about what's going on. And I think part of it is, frankly, a little bit of random walk. So if we look at the UK side, DFID was created by a very powerful minister, Claire Short, who really sort of put who really altered from the body of a previous sort of aid unit to cleanse quizzical brow, and who really altered the sort of trajectory of the agency in a way that I think made real differences for the future. One part of that path-dependent change is the kind of people you hire, right? And the kind of agents who are in the organization. So if you have a crappy job, it's really hard to get good people to do it, right? You can't hire good people to do crappy work. If the job is crappy, good people are going to leave. Less good people are going to come in, over the years, right? I was speaking to a senior manager at an aid organization who said to me, look, I've been here 35 years, and 25 years ago, yeah, those people were great. I would have trusted those people. But now you're saying I should trust these folks, and they're just not up to the job, right? And even if that's true, well, in my view, that, at least in part, and maybe in a whole, reverses cause and effect, right? So that is to say, we can change the nature of the personnel by changing the nature of the job. And if we do that, that doesn't mean we take today's staff and let them run free. That doesn't mean we ever let any staff run entirely free. But maybe what we need to do is turn that knob slowly rather than all at once. And I agree, the skill and judgment of the people is critical. And if we focus a lot more on kind of selection, right, of those folks, and a lot less on sanction, and on letting people make judgments and fail and learn and get better, I think that's the way to kind of turn the cycle in a way that helps us move the equilibrium of where the aid agencies are. A few more questions.
Hi, Professor. Do you see anything in your research about local versus international hires? Does it matter if the one navigating the judgment is South African versus a British person?
Two-part related question. You mentioned the AIDS delivery one, how number-based evaluation is very useful. So throughout your research, have you noticed, are there particular sectors or types of projects that are more amenable to top-down management and which are not? And the second part is, do you feel like for the recipient country, do they prefer one or the other? Like, do they necessarily want more freedom, or do they actually prefer to have a rubric that they can work towards?
Maybe in front?
Thanks again for the talk. I guess I was wondering, was it too politically sensitive or not appropriate to make like a composite score for each donor? Because that would be quite interesting to see what everybody's score ended up being.
On what?
In terms of the navigation by judgment, you know, we're saying DFID is great, USA is bad. Where does ECHO fall? Where does GAC fall? Where does CETA fall? Then in terms of the donors themselves, the different departments within donors, did we disaggregate by within USAID OFTA projects or within OFTA DART projects and things like that? And then since NGOs are, I think, key to this in some way, did you find any differences, or do we think there's anything to see in terms of the kind of contractors that these donors pick that changes the outcomes of the projects? Thanks.
Thanks. Okay, let me just take those maybe. So, so first to say I don't look at, there are a couple of questions here that the answer is simply I don't know. So, local versus international people, to Lorenzo's question, I think I don't know systematically, and if you ask what the implication of the theory is, it's what you know and where you're oriented. So sometimes we could imagine that varying on a local versus international personnel level. Sometimes we could imagine both local and international personnel pointing in the right direction. In fact, in the South African municipal government case, some of the advisors, none of the advisors were local to their community, but some were South African nationals and some were not. Some, to go in the direction of the question, but to a much more sort of sensitive place, were white South Africans, and some were South Africans whose race matched those of the communities they were going to. What exactly is the margin on which local information, local knowledge is and can be gathered is, I think, an important question to keep thinking about. So I think people do want more freedom. So first, just to say, in what I test here, I'm looking at USAID headquarters versus USAID local, right? I'm not looking at the actual recipient country government, but I think the answer applies there too, but with the caveat we need to worry a lot more to the direction that Sam in front was asking about before. That is to say, where are people pointed and where are they likely to go in the absence of constraint? Because we're not inside the organization thinking about those systematic features. And the sort of, so Mary, to the composite score, there is a composite score. It's in Appendix 1 of the book for every organization. I think it's a rough proxy. I don't want to tell you that, like, I think you should use it to, like, I have the serial order of the agencies, but I don't think, there should be bronze medals awarded or, any sort of component like that. And I also don't think we should put pressure on the measure, because then we'd give agencies an incentive to game it without in any way improving their performance more broadly. I do think NGOs are part of the story. I think the identity of them is part of the story, but I also think the constraints on them are part of the story. And I think my work is not so good at figuring out identity of your NGO should be, who does the implementation, right? I think it has more to say about what the constraints on that NGO should be, which is to say, when we decide to buy services through an NGO, we write a contract. They're called contractors. The process is called contracting. What goes in a contract? Well, a lot of firm things you need the other firm to report against. In contract theory, in that subfield of economics, this question of what we buy and what we make is a central concern. Because when we make something rather than buy it, we can rely a lot more on judgment and on incomplete contracts than if we try to specify everything in a formal contract. Conditional on using a formal contract, there are also differences in how much we constrain people via those contracts, how much flexibility there is. And I think that Asim Prakash has some excellent work on charity chains, as he puts them, that suggests that constraint rolls downhill in those contexts. Too, and that we need to think hard about kind of what we're allowing the implementers to do and how we're constraining them through these projects. I also realized I missed part of your original question, which is, I think when we can shift measurement back, we should do that. But I think your case of the percent of people who get jobs is a great one. Unless we're going to run an RCT everywhere in the world, people get jobs for lots of different reasons, right? One of those reasons is the training in the workforce program that I imagine you're imagining that's a measure for. And so, in general, when we move towards outcomes, we need to worry about attributability, right? And whether the project is doing the work. Where that is a viable thing to do, I think it's a great idea. But I think we overestimate often when we talk about this, the range of projects in which that's a kind of reasonable approach, reasonable solution. And maybe let me take one or two more questions, and then we can move fully to kind of drinks and food. And I'm not going anywhere. Happy to keep talking about any of this, et cetera.
And this is specifically on your mention of the direction that these agencies err. So based on your research, is it more so that these agencies are erring because that they believe that being more top-down is a more effective approach? Or is it only because they're actually making active effort to strike a balance, but because of anchoring or effects related to their previous experience of the staff or any other circumstances, by the effect of in attempting to strike a balance, they err back towards the top-down?
Last question? No? Excellent. In that case, my answer to that question is yes. So that is to say, I think both the dynamics you just pointed to are in play. Agencies get it wrong because they think a top-down approach is going to help them, right? They also get it wrong because they're responding to the errors of the past. And I think the question is how we judge where to move the needle, right? And who controls kind of what agencies do. So in an American context, Vanessa Williamson can correct me, but about 20 years ago, there's a book called The Audit Society by a guy named Michael Porter, right? In which he talked about what happens when we put the auditors in charge effectively of what we do, right? Auditing is incredibly important. It is critical to make sure that our agencies are delivering public value. But putting the people who do that checking, putting the regime that does that checking in charge may not itself be the way to maximize public value. And whether we're talking about aid or education or sanitation, I think that's something we can think more about. Thank you all for coming.